Ambassador, for the very nice introduction, and thank you very much to ITAM and the organizers for having me here. I had heard very much about this event for many years. I understand it's the 23rd year of the ITAM conference, and it's quite a distinguished history, and I'm very happy today to talk about the global economy and Mexico and how reforms can help prosperity to be shared more widely. The first half of my presentation will be about the global economy, and the second half I want to talk about Mexico and a bit about the report, our semi-annual economic survey, which was just released yesterday. Principally, I think I want to start with the global context, and I think it's very important to realize that the global economy is stuck in a very low gear. We've had very weak growth since the global economic crisis in 2009, and the sort of forecasted strong recovery has been postponed repeatedly, and we're still not there yet. We're still anxiously awaiting a strong, broadly shared, sustained recovery throughout the world. There are some spots of brightness, which I will get to in a few moments. Trade growth has been weak almost everywhere, including in the United States, as well as in the large emerging markets, the BRIC economies. They're well below trend, and this is of considerable concern given the important gains that the global economy has obtained through international trade, and it's a particular concern to Mexico, which is so export dependent and so tightly integrated with the United States and with other global trade networks. And what I think is an important aspect of the current conjuncture is that demand patterns have been diverging. And I think the most remarkable divergence has been the euro area, where growth has been anemic and very slow for some time. There was a little bit of hope in 2011 with some strengthening of growth, which was accompanied by fairly strong support by the European Central Bank. Unfortunately, I think many observers felt that things would return to normal mechanically or relatively easily, and some of that support, the foot on the accelerator was lifted, perhaps prematurely, and we now have seen very little demand. I mean, that was partially fiscal belt tightening. There was a very strong obsession with fiscal policy in Europe, and the European Central Bank, I think, was very reluctant to use the kind of extraordinary measures that we've seen in the United States through the Federal Reserve Bank to support growth in a more, I would say, unconventional and more aggressive way. Unfortunately, Japan, another important block of the world economy, has also faced serious difficulties and halting fit starts in its recovery. On the bright side, the United States is finally starting to return to normal, and the several waves of quantitative easing seem to have helped to broaden gains in the labor market and help to improve both investment and consumption in that economy, which is, I think, very good news for Mexico. The sluggishness in Europe can be seen quite remarkably on a GDP per capita basis, with only the United States and peripheral economies in Europe doing much stronger. And that includes as well some of the big emerging markets, where growth as well has been somewhat weaker than we'd seen in recent years. There's been a divergence in growth performance across much of the emerging markets, the BRIC economies. China's growth, while still strong, is much weaker than it was in recent years. We're seeing growth significantly reduced from its double-digit rates that we saw not that many years ago to even below 7%, and some concerns that it may weaken further. India has had very weak growth as well. We've seen some slight hope with the new administration for a new appetite for reform. Brazil, again, has had a recession. With the re-election of the president, we have seen some hope for renewed enthusiasm for reform, but then very bad news in Russia with the fall of the ruble and a lot of loss of confidence there. Our global economic forecast, which we released in late November and gave an early peek for the G20, suggested that global growth would gradually strengthen in 2015 and continue thereafter in 2016. With the leader of the pack being the United States, with a fairly strong and sustained recovery there from about 2% growth in 2014 to slightly above 3% growth in 2015, and continuing at about approximately that pace in 2016. The euro area is highly uncertain, anemic growth this year, and a hopeful recovery, which is highly conditional on continued support from the European Central Bank and much more aggressive measures, and I think conditional as well on political turmoil not spilling over too badly. As you can see, we even forecast a slowdown in Japan and a kind of moderate growth or slight improvement in 2016 in the emerging markets. Mexico, on the other hand, we see actually quite bright news. I know that there's quite a kind of pessimistic view of the economy here, and perhaps for good reason. There's a lot of problems, and I think the growth has been very weak in the past couple of years, and the forecasted recoveries have not yet come. But I think if we focus on the U.S. recovery, which I think is now firmly entrenched, I think that's very good news for Mexico. We're very enthusiastic about the reforms, which I'll get to in a moment, and we see growth continuing to strengthen. I think that our 2014 forecast, which was a vintage of November, it was before the third quarter GDP release, is probably still a little bit on the optimistic side. I think we'll see growth probably closer to 2% for 2014. But we do anticipate a sustained recovery and growth approaching 4% this year and continuing at approximately that pace in 2016. These forecasts were done before the incredible fall of oil prices. There was already some indication of that. The news on oil prices is somewhat mixed for different countries. Globally, it's a net positive. We see almost half a percentage point boost to the global economy from lower oil prices and lower prices of energy. So this is an important, I think, context to think about. While it may have some risks for Mexico, it's a net positive for the world economy, and that can have positive effects on demand in Mexico. We do think that oil prices have probably bottomed out. The yield curve shows a gradual recovery in oil prices and the glut gradually being dissipated, and this should help to I think, give greater hope for the much anticipated benefits of the energy reform to have net positives in the medium term. The second major risk that we see to the global economic recovery, and particularly to emerging markets, including Mexico, is the tightening of U.S. monetary policy as things start to return to normal in the macroeconomy and GDP starts to firm up. The Fed has started to raise, to give signals that it will be easing out quantitative easing and starting to raise rates very soon. Previous communications of the Fed in this regard have caused quite a bit of volatility in financial markets and as well as for exchange rates and including capital flows. While I think that, and we believe that Mexico has a very solid macroeconomic framework and good policy credibility, so it's probably faces fewer risks than many other emerging markets. It still does face some risks depending on how investors perceive the pace of withdrawal of easy monetary policy. So I think that's something to be concerned about, but it's not. It's a downside risk rather than our mainstream scenario. Let me just say a little bit about policies before moving on to Mexico and our view on structural policies. As I mentioned, I think monetary policy needs to remain accommodative in the medium term. We see much more aggressive quantitative easing necessary in Europe. We've leaned on the European Central Bank quite strongly. They have finally made a unanimous decision to engage in quantitative easing, and we think that they will be rolling that out very soon, and that's essential, and it underpins the recovery that we see in 2016 in Europe. Fiscal consolidation perhaps has gone too far, and we think that something of a pause can happen even in Europe as long as there's clear fiscal frameworks for consolidation. This will help the monetary support to have its effect and help to underpin the recovery. But I think that the main mantra that we have had, especially in the G20 context, and our Secretary General has I think, trumpeted around the world, is that structural reforms are where the action can be found. Structural reforms include product market, labor market reforms, regulatory reforms, institutional reforms, a lot of areas where we see win-win policies. These are policies that don't necessarily entail significant financial costs or fiscal costs. They even can have positive effects in the short run. While I think there's a lot of fear that deregulation and certain kinds of labor market reforms may have negative effects in the short run, we've done a lot of research in recent years that suggests that many of those reforms, if they're well designed, can have even positive effects in the short run, and even in the medium term can have very positive beneficial effects, and these can help to support growth, sustain job creation, and build trade performance. Mexico has been exemplary among G20 countries in its pursuit of structural reforms, and these have been to address a major challenge in productivity that Mexico has faced. The OECD, we benchmark structural reforms and how they perform in different countries, and we've made recommendations on an annual basis, and then we look at how countries follow up on those reforms that they help to identify and that we identify using systematic indicators. And in using these indicators over the past 2 years, Mexico is the standout country throughout the OECD in terms of its pursuit of I would say, well-designed reforms. So those legislated reforms that are on paper appear to be all in the right direction. And we're very, I would say, even bullish about the design of those reforms. Now, those reforms are contingent on many other aspects, including full implementation on an administrative basis, on an institutional basis. They require strong legal institutions to enforce. I'll come back to those in a moment. I will say that in recent years, the only country that came close were the European periphery that were in programs, IMF, EU programs that required them to implement reforms. I think what's remarkable about Mexico's reforms is that they occurred outside of that context. There was a long history of slow growth that I think helped to motivate these reforms, but otherwise they were, well, I think perhaps the strongest point was very weak productivity performance. We measure total factor productivity, kind of basically doing more with the same amount of resources. And here, Mexico has not done very well in recent decades. We've seen very weak total factor productivity growth. It's a principal challenge. This is where I think you can really help to boost incomes with the existing resources, and a lot of convergence takes place through increasing productivity. If you look at other major emerging markets, particularly China, much of its rapid growth has come from productivity. This is productivity growth on an annual basis, and you can see it's tremendous. I mean, most of the growth has come from productivity. Latin America has traditionally lagged in its productivity growth. I think it's partially because of natural resource intensive economies, which tend to have weak, if not negative, total factor productivity growth. And that's also why we're very happy to hear that Mexico has been pursuing a productivity commission that helps to sort of focus policies around these kinds of issues. We look back in the past few decades, we saw a kind of unsustained boom in the 60s and 70s, and then a series of crises, and then I would say a strengthening of macroeconomic policies, but relatively weak growth over the past couple of decades. And this is, I think, part of the call to arms for the recent wave of reform. Also, high levels of inequality. They have been coming down recently, but they're among the highest in the OECD, even after taxes and transfers and benefits. And this is, I think, an important part of the way that we see growth. We see a lot of feedback effects coming from both inequality to growth and growth to inequality, and there's growing evidence that you have to work, that the growth needs to be inclusive for it to be sustainable. And this is an important, I think, lesson of the reforms, and I think a number of the aspects of their design have taken this in mind. We've given a lot of credit to the Pacto por México. I know that it's over now, but it was a remarkable moment. We haven't seen this kind of political synergy in many countries where the main parties came together, agreed on a package of reforms, and really pursued them in a sustained way, and really followed them through more or less to the end. So most of the second round legislation has already been passed, and these reforms were, in many cases, remarkable. We've done an assessment of these reforms, and we think that they can boost GDP per capita growth by 1 percentage point on an annual basis at a 5-year horizon, and that's basically on an annual basis over the next decade on average, which is a really tremendous increase in growth performance. We see potential growth is slightly over 3%, so with an additional percentage point of growth that could push sustainable GDP growth in Mexico to over 4%, which is almost enough for it to start to really converge to the OECD economies. I'll come back to, I think that Mexico needs more, and we identified some reforms where more could be done. But even though that first wave of reforms is conditional on implementation of those legislative reforms, both from an administrative government's perspective as well as from a legal perspective, this requires strengthening of legal institutions to ensure that enforcement is consistent, that there's not excessive corruption, that that government implements the reforms as anticipated, that bidding is fair, that we can observe that businesses have the confidence to make very large-scale investments, and that they won't have uncertainty about the legal and property rights risks. The bold reforms cover all areas. I mean, I think you all know them very well. They started with labor reforms. There were early legal reforms, major education constitutional reform, tax reform, which wasn't so popular but was essential to build, to create the resources for a number of the other reforms, the financial reform, which improved banking sector competitiveness, transparency and access to information, which can help to promote less corruption, improvements in the legal code, incremental reforms to the legal system, and then the telecom and energy reforms, which were tremendous changes to sectors that had been traditionally dominated by monopolies for some time. We also saw political reforms, which we see as very important because they change the incentives of local and state governments. The ability to have re-election, we have seen in many countries, is essential to allowing governments to really invest in the medium term. And then we saw some reforms of criminal justice. They probably haven't gone far enough. There was a major constitutional amendment in 2008 that had a deadline of 2016. Things are somewhat behind. There's an ambitious plan to meet that deadline, but probably a lot of work will need to be done to make that deadline, and we see more scope for going further. That constitutional reform focused on the criminal justice system, which is essential to help to improve security, but we also see scope for improving the courts in the mercantile, the commercial, and the civil justice areas, and there's been less progress in these areas, although there has been some, I see, renewed efforts here to address these types of issues. And this is where we see sort of the next wave of reform, really making a concerted focus on this area and helping to address both justice, the efficiency of justice, the fairness of justice, as well as help to, I would say, strengthen anti-corruption institutions and build on the quality of local and regional governments. We also see important reforms to expenditure policies that include a pension reform which hasn't yet been fully implemented. I know that there's a lot of uncertainties about fiscal revenues. We do think that Mexico is well protected for 2015. We'll need to, I think the budget will have to, I mean, so the Minister Videgaray said yesterday that if oil prices stay low, that they may need to re-examine the budget from 2016 onward. We do think there's scope for spending efficiency improvements. The fiscal reform still hasn't had its full effect. But we do think that addressing the kind of making growth more inclusive is a really top priority, so it shouldn't be left behind. Improving health, I mean, Mexico has full coverage through Seguro Popular, but the quality of care and the coverage of the coverage is still remains to be improved. So in our assessment of the first wave of reform, we see the telecom and energy reforms as having the most important effects. Lower energy prices could lower those effects somewhat in the medium term. However, we do see that the bidding systems have been well designed and that the first rounds of bidding have focused on lower cost oil fields, which may still be quite sustainable and generate considerable investor interest. Legal reform is an important aspect. It's not fully incorporated in this set of models, and we also see important benefits from financial reform, which we weren't fully able to quantify, but we do see the important benefits in the medium term. Now, that was the first percentage point addition to sustainable GDP growth, but the second percentage point that we see could come through much broader legal reforms, administrative reforms, and improving quality of regulation. And this is really, I think, the most important point that I would like to make. And this is, of course, it's, I think, the events that have happened in recent months in Guero and elsewhere, I think, bring particular attention to these, and I think have helped to build, I think, strong public awareness and support for these very difficult reforms, which usually take decades in many countries to take place. And I think, Mexico perhaps can do them in a matter of years if it puts a concerted focus on these kinds of issues. We also see important scope for benefits through reducing informality and reducing income and gender inequalities. Mexico is among the countries that has the most scope for boosting growth through making women, allowing them to participate more in the labor force, and more female-friendly policies that, including boosting healthcare and providing all families with high-quality healthcare. And we see some scope in our economic survey, which was released yesterday, as I mentioned, and we outline a number of healthcare reforms that could help to boost the quality of care. And education, we see has the largest benefit in the longer term. The front-loaded benefits are less, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be pursued with considerable urgency. The second percentage point of growth, we tried to do an assessment of the contributions. I have a couple of research papers that have been published that help to build support for this kind of. We looked at differences in judicial quality across Mexican states, and we saw that gaps in the quality of judicial institutions were associated with considerable differences in the size of firms, with investment and productivity. And so if we even do a moderate reform scenario of Mexico converging to the best performance among Mexican states, not trying to converge to some frontier across the OECD, but just trying to sort of bring up the laggard states to somewhat above the average level, we can see very large benefits in terms of improved business climate, greater security of contracts, and I think strengthening of investment and reducing transaction costs. We also see a lot of benefits from reducing informality. The fiscal reform has a lot of interesting features which help to promote the integration of informal firms and informal workers into the formal economy, and we see a lot of scope for strengthening and broadening the base of productivity and activity there. This will require a lot of enforcement, so it's not just a matter of getting the right fiscal policies, you don't want firms to join the tax regime and then exit it later. So it requires a kind of continued focus on bringing those firms into the fold in a positive way, so offering carrots and sticks. And this is, I think, countries that have had success in reducing informality have done this, and actually Brazil is a good example where they've actually had quite some success, and their policies are quite similar to the ones that have been incorporated in the new fiscal reform, and I think in the President's new Go Formal program. So let me just close with kind of our optimistic scenario. We see very anemic growth over the past couple of decades, strengthening with the Peña Nieto reforms if they are indeed implemented and legal institutions are strengthened. This is actually the scenario you see there in the dotted line is based only on about 1 percentage point, but with 2 percentage points of growth with that second wave of reforms, we could see even stronger recovery of GDP per capita and stronger convergence to the more advanced countries in the OECD. Let me stop here. I don't know, we have a couple of minutes for questions, and maybe I'll return to my seat so we can share the questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Tendríamos unos minutos que nos ha aceptado el señor Sean, una serie de preguntas a pesar de su agenda tan apretada. No sé si ya hayan pasado alguna serie de preguntas, pero sí me gustaría preguntarle a Sean, if there's such a optimism point of view from the OECD and in general in the international markets, why do you think there's kind of pessimism in Mexico? How can we put them together? Because it's like two words and things that are happening. What's your perception and how we can overcome this different trend that we're seeing? Y por favor, si tienen más preguntas, hacerlas y pasarlas, por favor.
I think this is a really important perplexity for us outside of Mexico, this divergence in perception about the prospects for Mexico. I do think it's partially based on a few waves of failed reforms. We have seen some major efforts to reform the economy. A number of the reforms that were part of the Pacto por Mexico were actually, some elements of them were in previous reform waves. But if we look at a number of them, the second round legislation or the third round legislation was never passed. And so the kind of teeth for the reforms was never there. And then going beyond that, the strengthening of government institutions has been lagging. And I think that's part of the reason that things have been, there's a kind of lack of enthusiasm. And I think some of the unfortunate events that have happened in the past year, the extreme violence and the drug wars have weakened some local governments. But I do think if we look on an international comparable basis, I think that the reforms are really unprecedented, and the how far they have gone, I think, is maybe hard to really see, and perhaps the noise of the violence and some of the unfortunate events have overcome the quality of the reforms. We're very impressed with the design of the reforms when we've done careful analysis of the legislative aspects of these. But the governance challenges are certainly there, and the political challenges are also considerable. But we do have confidence that the government seems to have sort of broken records in many cases, and perhaps it can continue to do so.
Las ventajas de ser coordinador es que puedo hacer otra pregunta. El señor Sean estuvo trabajando mucho en China, entonces me gustaría preguntarle qué considera que son los factores que hicieron ese brinco de una economía subdesarrollada a ser probablemente la número 1 o 2 potencia del mundo. I would like to ask you why is you were working in China, so you know very well, and we have seen a huge dramatic change from a country that was so poor and suddenly it's becoming one or the second wealthiest or biggest economy worldwide. What do you think are the key elements that produce that?
Actually, I think that's a good point, and thanks for raising that. I mean, actually, I spent time on the ground in both China and India and wrote our first economic surveys of both economies. China in the 1980s was particularly, it really went through some very difficult times and came from a place that's very far from Mexico. Mexico is already, I think, established in some areas some very world-class institutions, world-class cities, and I think it really understands the market economy. And I think what is lacking is, I think, competition in many domains, and that's been the main focus of the reforms where we see having the largest impact. And these reforms, I think, have addressed key bottlenecks in the system. I mean, for instance, the legal system. I mean, regulators in telecoms and other sectors were continually to face amparos that were blocking decisions. But there's been these major constitutional amendments that now have enabled regulators to be much more effective and make decisions, which we see real reactions from the main players that they seem to be, reassessing the competitive environment. India, on the other hand, I think tells some other lessons where we saw a lack of enthusiasm for reform resulting in a big slowdown just before the new president was elected. And I think that, that shows that, economies that are in the convergence process, still building institutions, it's a complicated process and it requires a concerted effort. And I think that, we shouldn't give up too early. 2 years is not very long. You need to have patience for these reforms to take place. Answer these? Okay. Well, we have, I guess, a question from the audience. wait, the question is about corruption and what is Mexico's relative position in the world and what legal and economic reforms could help to lower corruption. I think if we had the slide before, just the pointer, yes, pointed out that Mexico's position is, well, among OECD economies. No, I can just... Shows that Mexico is, well, among OECD countries, it's one with the highest perception of corruption, but it's also, in general, we find that corruption perception is fairly highly correlated with GDP, that institutions take time to develop and that you can't necessarily have perfect institutions before, you can't step one forward without the other. And this is an ongoing process and takes time to build. But we do think that legal institutions are the underpinning of improving incentives. And so having efficient courts that with high-quality judges and lawyers are essential. And Mexico has a number of areas of weakness, but these can be addressed. And I think the key elements of this are already being focused upon. We do think that an anti-corruption institution needs to be fully enabled. This is something that's still pending in the Senate, and we think that needs to be passed. I know there's been some re-examination of that in the context of the events in Iguala, but we're hopeful that this can be tackled. There aren't that many examples of countries sort of tackling corruption overnight, so we shouldn't be, but growth can happen nevertheless. So.
Muchas gracias, Sean. Nuestro siguiente expositor ya ha llegado. Hay todavía algunas preguntas que no vamos a poder contestar. Yo se las voy a dar a Sean para que él pueda pues hacer contacto con ustedes. Sean, thank you very much. We're running out of time, and our next guest is already here. So thank you very much for your participation. You gave us a great outlook about Mexico and its comparison with other countries. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.